This is the American Forces Network, Europe.
This is the American Forces Network, Europe. This live coverage provided by the NBC Radio and Television Network and relayed to Europe via satellite by the American Forces Radio and Television Service. AFN's next scheduled live Apollo coverage, the lunar landing on Friday at 23 hours. Upcoming on AFN, a short interlude of music. Listen to AFN News on the Hour for progress reports on the flight of Apollo 15.
AFN News, a summary from the wires of the AP and UPI. Here is Paul Macco.
Good afternoon. At the top of the news, America's latest attempt to put men on the moon, the Apollo 15, has been launched flawlessly from Cape Kennedy and now is in orbit. The astronaut trio, David Scott, Alfred Worden, and James Irwin, soared into space at 1434 Central European Time to begin man's fourth journey to the lunar surface. The astronauts called off readings calmly and without excitement as the giant Saturn rockets thrust the spaceship skyward. The 12-day trip will be attempting to break every space record except the endurance record set by the Soviets, which resulted in the deaths of the 3 Russian cosmonauts. Mission Control reports all phases of the launch went without a hitch.
At the sound of the last tone, it will be 18 hours, Central European Time.
The World at 1800, a detailed summary of late news developments from the wires of the AP and UPI on this 26th day of July, 1971. From the AFN Europe Central News Desk in Frankfurt, here is David Minot.
Good evening. All systems are reported go for the Apollo 15 as it heads toward the moon. The U.S. command in Saigon reports 4,100 more Americans have been withdrawn from the war zone, and East German and West Berlin officials meet to discuss the possibility of allowing visits across the wall. These are top stories in the world of 1800. Now, details. 3 American astronauts are on their way to the moon. David Scott, James Irwin, and Alfred Worden blasted out of Earth orbit to begin the quarter-of-a-million-mile trip after what can only be described as a letter-perfect countdown and launch from Cape Kennedy. A week-long countdown at the Cape was noteworthy because of the lack of problems which have cropped up in previous missions. And at 14:34 hours, Central European Time today, the big moment arrived.
10, 9, 8, ignition sequence start, engines armed, 5, 4, 3...
Now past the tower. The Saturn V is climbing off its pad. It is tilted over slightly. It's by the tower, and the Apollo 15 is on its way into the sky. And here you can hear the roar as it reaches our vantage point just 3 miles away. The shock waves are so great that they're actually shattering our NBC trailer here, where we're watching the Saturn V with the Apollo 15 spacecraft lift into a bright sky. She's going beautifully. There's thousands of people standing. Binoculars on her now. People watching. Cameras rolling. And she's climbing oh so steady. She's going great. Right on into the sky now. She's beginning to enter a thin wisp of cloud. She's going on up straight and true. Everything right on target.
The perfect liftoff was followed by insertion into Earth orbit, which occurred several minutes after the third stage booster shut down. Scott commented that the Saturn V performed flawlessly and that the astronauts experienced a very smooth ride. After a single orbit of the Earth, during which all systems were given a final check, the third stage S-4B engine fired again to send the Apollo 15 out of Earth orbit and on a trajectory toward the moon. The Apollo 15 mission is described as the longest, costliest, and potentially most rewarding manned flight in the history of space travel. Friday, the spacecraft is to go into orbit around the moon, and Scott and Irwin are to take the Falcon lunar lander down to the surface between a 1,000-foot deep canyon and the 2-mile-high Apennine Mountains. Saturday, they are to leave the lander to begin exploring aboard their 4-wheeled moon buggy. After a record 67 hours on the lunar surface, Scott and Irwin are to blast off to rejoin Worden in the orbiting command module. They then are to release a lunar orbital satellite and begin the trip back to Earth. Splashdown in the Pacific is scheduled for August 7th.
sound of the last tone, it will be 22 hours, Central European Time. The World at 2200. A detailed summary of news developments from the wires of the AP and UPI on this 26th day of July, 1971. From the AFN Europe Central News Desk in Frankfurt, here is Bob Andresen.
Good evening. Apollo 15 heads for the moon despite a minor valve problem in the service propulsion system engine. The Senate votes against cloture in the Lockheed Bill controversy. A proposal to give the Senate control over selection of the new U.S. delegate to the Vietnam peace talks in Paris. And the Pentagon decides against quick declassification of the Pentagon Papers. These are top stories in the world at 2200. Now details. Man's most ambitious moon mission is underway. Apollo 15 lifted off this afternoon from Cape Kennedy, Florida at 14:34 Central European Time. NBC News recorded the final 30 seconds of the countdown and was 3 miles downrange to report as the huge Saturn V rocket blasted overhead.
30 seconds and counting. The guidance system will go internal at the 17-second mark. Now 25 seconds. We have complete clearance for launch. We are go. 20. 15 seconds. Guidance internal. 13, 12, 11, 10, 9, 8. Ignition sequence start. Engines armed. 5, 4, 3. Out past the tower. The Saturn V is climbing off its pad. It is tilted over slightly. It's by the tower, and the Apollo 15 is on its way into the sky. And here you can hear the roar as it reaches our vantage point just 3 miles away. She's going beautifully. There's thousands of people standing. Binoculars on her now. People watching. Cameras rolling. And she's climbing oh so steady. She's going straight right on into the sky now. She's beginning to enter a thin wisp of cloud. She's going on up straight and true, everything right on target. The Apollo 15 is on its way.
At 17:30 hours this evening, the spacecraft blasted out of Earth orbit and headed toward the moon. Half an hour after that maneuver, the 3 astronauts completed docking with the command ship Endeavour and the landing craft Falcon. Endeavour and Falcon will remain docked nose to nose until Friday, when astronauts David Scott and James Irwin descend to the moon's surface. There has been one minor problem encountered so far, 2 valves sticking in one of the ship's maneuver engines. CBS News reports that because of the many backup features, neither the astronauts nor space agency officials are worried.
2 valves are working improperly in the service propulsion system, the rocket engine which corrects the course of Apollo 15 on its way to the moon and which kicks it out of lunar orbit and back towards Earth. Indicators in the cabin and via telemetry back on Earth say they're stuck in the open position when they should be closed. So 2 circuit breakers have been opened on the control board to lessen the already remote possibility of an accidental firing. Like everything else aboard Apollo 15, the 2 valves are backed up by other redundant systems, and the ground controllers in Houston are not taking the problem too seriously. Apollo 15, the command module Endeavour, and the lunar module Falcon with its lunar rover on board are coasting up towards the moon, checking their equipment, some 25,000 miles out now, going 9,000 miles an hour, and getting ready for lunch in about half an hour. George Herman, CBS News Space Headquarters in New York.
On the ground, the Florida Highway Patrol estimates more than 1 million space fans saw the liftoff from along the beach south of the launching pad. President Nixon chose to watch it on television from Camp David, Maryland, and through a statement issued by the White House, which wished the 3 American astronauts Godspeed. Group W News in London notes that the British press is giving tonight's Ali Frazier fight
At the sound of the last tone, it will be 12 hours, Central European Time.
AFN World News and Sports Roundup, a summary of late developments from the wires of the AP and UPI. From the AFN Europe Central News Desk in Frankfurt, here is Gary Bautel.
Good afternoon. Apollo 15 is now hurtling toward the moon at more than 4,200 miles per hour, but uncertainty hangs over the moon landing phase of the mission. It won't be known until this evening whether astronauts David Scott and James Irwin will become the seventh and eighth men to leave their footprints on the lunar surface. That landing hinges on an investigation into a nagging short circuit involving a giant main engine that will bring Apollo back to Earth. The difficulty involves an instrument panel light which flickered on when it should have been off. The signal is symptomatic of three possible problems, the worst of which would mean that the lunar landing would be scrubbed and the astronauts would have to settle for a moon orbit mission. The verdict is expected at about 9:30 this evening when the astronauts fire their command ship engine to make a minor course correction. The spacemen themselves are in no danger, and there is no question that they can get back to Earth, even if the troublesome control panel switch causes the landing on the moon's surface to be abandoned. Flight Director Milton Wendler says he believes there is only a low probability that the problem can prove serious enough to scrub the landing.
Central European time is now 15 hours.
AFN News, a summary from the wires of the AP and UPI.
This is Specialist Brian Dowling reporting. Good afternoon. Although space officials are emphasizing the Apollo 15 astronauts are in no danger, the landing phase of the mission onto the moon is in doubt. Two valves in one of the course correction rockets seem to be sticking, and it will not be known until tests are conducted at 9:30 tonight if the problem is real. A physicist at an Apollo tracking station says two major sun flares might foul up communications between the Earth and the Apollo 15 within the next few days. Solar flares are massive explosions on the surface of the sun which emit powerful radiation that interferes with the radio communications on or near Earth.
At the sound of the last tone, it will be 18 hours, Central European time. The World at 1800. A detailed summary of late news developments from the wires of the AP and UPI on this 27th day of July, 1971. From the AFN Europe Central News Desk in Frankfurt, here's David Minor.
Good evening. A crucial test aboard the moon-bound Apollo 15, increasing combat action in Indochina, and congressional action on the Lockheed loan bill as the U.S. rail strike appears headed for legislative attention. These are top stories in the world at 1800. Now details. The Apollo 15 astronauts have been ordered to run a special test on their main engine this evening to determine whether a control system short circuit is serious enough to scrub a moon landing attempt Friday. The crucial test is set for 1904 hours Central European time. An Apollo official says there are about 2 chances out of 3 the rocket will work using makeshift control procedures and clear the way for the lunar landing. The problem is said to pose no danger to the astronauts, and even if the moon landing is called off, they would return safely to Earth. The problem developed in the spacecraft's main engine last night. Earlier today, Apollo 15 launch director Milton Wendler held a news conference to discuss the possible causes of the malfunction in the spacecraft's engine. Wendler said the worst situation would be if a circuit breaker were to pop.
One is that the indication may be totally instrumentation type thing. It has nothing to do with the engine condition. The second is that the engine may come on prematurely if we use normal procedures, but which we can control adequately if we use workaround manual procedures, which is the second best situation. Or thirdly, that the problem may be such that it would pop a circuit breaker, rendering that bank unusable, which of course would be the most pessimistic or the worst situation that we could get into.
Milton Wendler, launch director for the Apollo 15. CBS News in Houston says that if you're superstitious about natural signs, as scientists seldom are, You might have regarded the appearance of a porpoise yesterday just before the Apollo blasted off as a good luck sign.
There is an uncertain balance between nature and NASA. Yesterday, moments before launch from Cape Kennedy, a porpoise went splashing by. That's considered a good sign by mariners, and the launch was perfectly normal, with some credit perhaps going to that porpoise. Well, this morning, officials here are trying to figure out whether there is trouble now with the main engine on the command module, which would force a lunar landing to be canceled, or whether the trouble actually is with the trouble light, or some contaminated switches. Houston is humid as usual, and that brings out all sorts of things that slither and go bump in the night. Beetles large enough to clump audibly as they clamber about, and a short while ago, a friendly-looking toad. Depending on their view of nature, superstitious space officials might consider that bad. But though the signs of nature could be considered ominous, NASA remains confident that a lunar landing will be possible. Steve Young, CBS News, Manned Spacecraft Center, Houston.
A physicist at an Apollo 15 monitoring station says two hot spots on the sun could temporarily foul communications between the Earth and the moon-bound spaceship within the next few days. But the scientist says the astronauts would be in no danger unless they are outside the spacecraft during a large solar flare. The Soviet Union reports that its two Mars shots launched in May are on course toward the red planet and operating according to schedule. One of the craft has traveled nearly 11 million miles and the other slightly more than 10 million. The Mars stations are expected to reach the planet in November. The Russians have not said what they will do, but some hints in the Soviet press and the enormous size of the two ships, 4.5 tons each, suggest the possibility of a planned soft landing on the Martian surface. Such is not planned for America's Mariner 9 Mars probe, which is expected to reach the planet about the same time as the Soviet probes. The U.S. spacecraft will make its readings of Mars from out in space.
Central European time is now 21 hours.
AFN News, a summary from the wires of the AP and UPI. Here is Jan Wood.
At the top of the news, a perfect 1-second firing of the Apollo 15's main engine has erased fears the moon landing might have to be canceled. The brief engine burn was monitored on board the command module Endeavour and at the Manned Spacecraft Center in Houston, while experts kept an eye on the warning light that indicated trouble in the engine's fuel system. After the test, officials decided the trouble is in the warning light circuit rather than the engine, and that the Apollo 15 mission should proceed as planned. They notify the astronauts that they have a green light to go into orbit around the moon on Thursday in preparation for Friday's planned landing on the lunar surface.
22 hours, Central European time.
The World at 2200, a detailed summary of news developments from the wires of the AP and UPI on this 27th day of July, 1971. From the AFN Europe Central News Desk in Frankfurt, here is Bob Andresen.
Good evening. Apollo 15 gets the go-ahead for a landing Friday. Secretary of Defense Melvin Laird reveals a 16% cut in draft calls, and jury selection continues in the court-martial of Captain Ernest Medina. These are top stories in the World of 2200. Now details. The Apollo 15 astronauts have overcome the only problem that has cropped up so far in their mission to the moon. A flickering panel light that indicated a stuck valve in the spacecraft's main engine had raised fears that the planned moon landing might have to be canceled. The engine has a backup valve system, but officials said if one of the systems were malfunctioning, the landing maneuver would have to be scrubbed for safety reasons. A test of the engine was carried out at about 7:15 this evening, and NBC newsman Jay Barbree monitored the spacecraft communications.
So everything is still on course. They're 131,000 miles from Earth, and we're waiting for confirmation from the Mission Control Center to see whether or not...
Denver, this is Houston.
Here's the call.
Okay, go ahead. Roger, guys. When you're comfortably through with the procedure here, we'd like for you to turn the thrust light out for us, please, by pulling the EMS, main A and B circuit breakers, two of them,
on panel 8.
Roger, both open, the light is out.
Okay, Dave, and the reason for that is just to conserve that light bulb and a little power. And that burn was exactly what we wanted to see. We'll proceed with the normal mission.
Well, there's your answer. We will proceed with the normal mission, because what it means is that both sides of the rocket propulsion system worked as they should have worked. So it is apparently, without question now, to the flight controllers here in Houston, within the monitoring display system of the spacecraft and not within the rocket propulsion system itself. So Apollo 15 remains on course to go in orbit around the moon on Thursday with a landing on Friday. This is Jay Barbree, NBC News at the Manned Spacecraft Center, Houston.
The green light from Houston caused a sigh of relief among officials in the space agency. They had visions of sending the Apollo on an expensive excursion around the moon and back to Earth without a landing. The timetable for the mission now calls for the Apollo to go into orbit around the moon tomorrow, with the landing set for Friday. It should be going into orbit around the moon Thursday, with the landing set for Friday. David Scott and James Irwin are to ride the lunar module Falcon down to a spot near the Apennine Mountains and spend 67 hours there, exploring with the aid of their four-wheeled moon buggy. Overhead, Alfred Worden is to conduct a series of experiments in lunar orbit. The three men are to return to the Earth August 6th. The Soviet Union is...
Tone, it will be 10 hours, Central European Time.
AFN News, a summary from the wires of the AP and UPI.
Good morning. America's moon-bound astronauts are in the middle of a 9-hour sleep period, after which they will conduct a light-flash cosmic ray experiment and make another inspection tour of their landing craft Falcon. All systems have the green light following a mid-course correction yesterday that cleared up doubts about the mission that had been raised by a shorted-out switch in the electrical system that controls fuel valves on one of the rocket's engines. With that taken care of, CBS News reports that Apollo 15 is go for all aspects of the 5th U.S. moon landing voyage.
At 14 minutes after 2 Eastern Daylight Time, the astronauts fired their main engine for less than a second and did two things in the process. They increased their velocity by something less than 4 miles an hour, as desired, and in the process they proved that in spite of an erroneously flashing signal light, all parts of the engine control system were okay. Houston gave them this approving word.
That burn was exactly what we wanted to see. We'll proceed with the normal mission.
Oh, that's nice to hear.
I'm a smooth talker, aren't I?
At the sound of the last tone, it will be 14 hours, Central European Time.
AFN News, a summary from the wires of the AP and UPI. Here is Bob Andresen.
The Apollo 15 is now more than 175,000 miles from Earth, moving at a speed of 2,500 miles an hour. CBS News reports that today is a period of relative inactivity for the astronauts, except for an upcoming inspection of the Falcon lunar lander.
This third day in space for astronauts Scott, Worden, and Irwin is scheduled to be just about the least demanding of the 12-day mission of Apollo 15. A planned third mid-course correction was canceled yesterday when the main engine fired successfully and kicked the spaceship into a perfect lunar course, proving a short circuit in a warning light was just that and not an engine malfunction which could have aborted a lunar landing. About all that's left to be done today, then, is a second untelevised inspection crawl into the lunar module by Scott and Irwin. The men will take her down Friday afternoon to a landing site between the lunar valley called Hadley-Rill and the majestic moon mountain of Apennine Front. The astronauts' scientific activities there, collecting rock and core samples, taking panoramic photographs, and exploring aboard a unique lunar hot rod called Rover, are expected to be the most thorough yet in the Apollo program. Steve Young, CBS News, Manned Spacecraft Center, Houston.
At the sound of the last tone, it will be 18 hours, Central European Time.
The World at 1800. A detailed summary of late news developments from the wires of the AP and UPI on this 28th day of July, 1971. From the AFN Europe Central News Desk in Frankfurt, here is Jan Wood.
Thank you and good evening, everyone. Red Chinese Premier Zhou Enlai discusses foreign policy with American students. AOK aboard Apollo 15. Another execution in the Sudan. President Nixon's Middle East expert arrives in Israel. And the Senate turns down an attempt to slow down a loan guarantee to Lockheed. These are the top stories in the world at 1800. Now details. The Apollo 15 astronauts are being allowed to sleep late today. They were scheduled to be awake at this hour, but Mission Control in Houston is allowing them at least an hour's extra rest because of a busy night, which kept them from their sleep period. CBS newsman Steve Young reports that extra sleep won't cut into the Apollo mission since today's schedule is uneventful.
The astronauts are asleep this morning, and Mission Control will let the scheduled flight plan slide some since the crew got to bed about 1 hour late last night. Ordinarily, the third day of a lunar mission is the most uneventful, and today, the third day of the Apollo 15 voyage, stands a good chance of being downright boring. Page after page of the flight plan, which normally is black with detailed activities, is practically blank. There was a mid-course correction scheduled for tonight, but it's been dropped as unnecessary. So the astronauts, aside from a few minor experiments and some exercise, today will lead the quiet life. Last night, Dave Scott and Jim Irwin went into the LEM. They found it in good shape, but some panel lights were out, and the glass shield above a radar meter had somehow been smashed. Most of the mess has been cleaned up, and the men will have another opportunity to housekeep when they return to the lunar lander Falcon later today. Mission Control says neither the remaining glass fragments nor the few inoperative panel lights will cause any problem. Steve Young, CBS News, Manned Spacecraft Center, Houston.
Continue to function normally aboard the Apollo 15 spacecraft as it speeds toward a lunar rendezvous. NBC News reports from the Manned Spacecraft Center in Houston that ground controllers allowed the astronauts to sleep an extra hour today because of their light work schedule.
Things have been going so well in space that Houston Control let the crew sleep an extra hour this morning. This was the brief conversation when they awoke. Astronaut Al Worden talking with communicator Joe Allen at Houston.
Good morning, Houston. This is 15. Read you out clear there, Joe. Good morning.
Good morning, Alfredo. It sounds like you had a good night's sleep. We're standing by for crew status.
Okay, Joe, we certainly did have a nice sleep, and it looks like your tracking data must be right. The moon's getting bigger out the window.
Roger, Al. At least our direction is right.
After that, Alan read some news headlines to the crew to bring them up to date on what's been happening here on Earth. At one point, the astronauts were asked if they had seen the mysterious flashes of light which have been reported by previous Apollo crews.
Out of curiosity, since we're coming up on this iFlash experiment, I wonder if any of you has noticed any of the flashes yet.
Yes, we've noticed them both nights, Joe.
Okay, I guess we'll talk more about that a little later on.
The light flashes, caused presumably by cosmic rays from the sun or by some other space emission, apparently do no harm to the eyes. Later today, another exercise period, another long picture-taking session out the spacecraft window, and some tests of the externally mounted cameras which will be used to map the moon. This is Peter Hackess at the NBC News Apollo Space Center.
The Apollo 15 spacecraft now is more than 200,000 miles from the Earth and less than 50,000 miles from the moon.
At the sound of the last tone, it will be 12 hours, Central European Time.
AFN World News and Sports Roundup, a summary of late developments from the wires of the AP and UPI. From the AFN Europe Central News Desk in Frankfurt, here is Jan Wood.
Thank you and good afternoon, everyone. Just hours away from entering lunar orbit, Apollo's 15 astronauts are in the tug of the moon's gravity. David Scott and his two space rookie companions were asleep when they passed from the dominant influence of Earth's gravity at 5:30 this morning. 2 hours earlier, Scott had to be a plumber as he plugged a leaking water tank. After the leak problem was solved, the astronauts lapsed back into the silence they have maintained through much of the voyage so far. Scott, Irwin, and Warden are asleep at this hour, but should be awaking in about 30 minutes from now. The Apollo 15 is scheduled to land on the lunar surface tomorrow.
At the sound of the last tone, it will be 14 hours, Central European Time. AFN News, a summary from the wires of the AP and UPI. Here is Bob Andresen.
Good afternoon. The Apollo 15 is now in the grasp of the moon's gravity and will enter lunar orbit at approximately 9 o'clock tonight. Last night, the astronauts' drinking water system began leaking into the command ship, but a quick response from ground control helped the 3 U.S. moon men stop the newest problem. When a ground communicator jokingly asked the astronauts if they threw the water overboard or drank it, they replied they mopped up the floating water with some towels. The wet towels are now hanging in the tunnel between the command ship and the lunar lander. According to a high military official in Heidelberg, the Army plans to introduce urinalysis tests to all soldiers rotating out of Europe, but the official does not say when such a program will go into effect. The tests are similar to those being given servicemen leaving South Vietnam to check on the use of hard drugs.
At the sound of the last tone, it will be 18 hours, Central European Time. The World in 1800, a detailed summary of late news developments from the wires of the AP and UPI on this 29th day of July, 1971. From the AFN Europe Central News Desk in Frankfurt, here is Paul Macco.
Good evening. Astronauts now are within the gravitational pull of the moon, and in little more than 3 hours, the space trio will fire the braking rockets to bring their spaceship into a lunar orbit. The Apollo 15 mission has been plagued by a number of minor problems, the latest of which appeared last night. CBS newsman Reed Collins reports.
In the grip of the moon now, Apollo 15 is sweeping faster toward its destination and will be in orbit later today. Last night it was nearly in hot water. In chlorinating the drinking water, Dave Scott ran into a problem.
We finally got a leak around the chlorine port with a cap on it. It seems to be leaking water. And you might take a look at that real quick and see if you can come up with any ideas on the thing. And in trying to clean it up, it seems like we're accumulating a fair amount of water right now. It's a pretty good flow right now.
Dave, I had a problem when I chlorinated on launch day, and when I first took the valve off, I had about what you've got, quite a strong flow.
Okay, Houston 15, got any suggestions yet? We need to isolate this thing pretty quick.
Astronaut Carl Henneis, who had found that leak on launch day, was able to come up with a solution in mission control. And then the obvious question.
Hey, what did you do with all that extra water? Stick it overboard or drink it or what?
Oh, no, we've got a bunch of towels hanging up in the tunnel right now. Looks like somebody's laundry.
A busy day lies ahead, and at the end of it, Apollo 15 will be swooping with 11 miles of the Moon Mountains, where Scott and Irwin are to land tomorrow. Reed Collins, CBS News, Space Headquarters, New York.
About 2 hours ago, the astronauts made a minor course correction, which was accomplished without difficulty. They also have jettisoned the door, which covers several service module experiments. The next major activity will be the firing of the braking rockets at 9:05 tonight, Central European Time. Following the braking activities and another maneuver to realign the orbit of the spacecraft, the space trio is scheduled to begin the sleep period. The moon landing is scheduled tomorrow night at 11:15 Central European Time. AFN News will broadcast network coverage of the lunar landing beginning at 23:05 tomorrow night.
At the sound of the last tone, it will be 22 hours, Central European Time.
The World at 2200. A detailed summary of news developments from the wires of the AP and UPI on this 29th day of July, 1971. From the AFN Europe Central News Desk in Frankfurt, here is Bob Andresen.
Good evening. Apollo 15 in orbit around the moon. A compromise in the Senate on the Lockheed loan bill. And David Bruce concludes his career at the Paris peace talks. These are top stories in the world at 2200. Now details. The Apollo 15 astronauts have completed another crucial phase of their historic spaceflight and now are in lunar orbit. A little more than a half hour ago, the trio fired the spacecraft's engine to begin a 6-day expedition around and on the moon to discover secrets held by the lunar surface for billions of years. Behind the moon and out of touch with mission control, the astronauts braked their command ship with a rocket burn which lasted almost 7 minutes. Then they came out from behind the moon and ABC was monitoring mission control.
This is Dean, this is Houston. How do you read? That was Carl Henai.
Hello, Houston. The Endeavour is on station with cargo, and what a fantastic sight.
Beautiful news. Romantic, isn't it?
Oh, this is really profound. I'll tell you. It's fantastic.
Dave Scott. First words from Dave Scott in lunar orbit.
Status report for you.
Okay, we're ready to copy whenever you're ready to give it. They're following orders. They're already dumping data, that's for sure.
Okay, I think our trusty pilot has a first for you on this one. Burn time was 6 plus 3/8. Ignition was on time. The residuals were 0, 0, and 0. Delta VC minus 4.8. The fuel, 33.25. The oxidizer, 33.3.
What that means is they didn't have to trim out the main engine burn by one slight iota.
That's a beautiful job up there.
A fine piece of flying. They are only 4 feet per second off the speed
and
they
it was
wanted.
a very smooth burn all the way, Carl. There was not a ripple. I guess the only little thing we might comment on was that we had a little parts operation after 6 minutes.
Okay, we copy.
In less than 4 hours, the Apollo 15 team again will ignite the main engine and swoop down to a minimum altitude of 9 miles from the moon's surface. As soon as they entered lunar orbit, David Scott, James Irwin, and Alfred Worden began the extensive series of tests which will help scientists determine the composition and origin of the moon. A 25-foot-long boom has been extended from the rear of the ship to examine the composition of the lunar crust by measuring the radiation it reflects. Tomorrow night, Scott and Irwin will crawl into the lunar lander, the Falcon, to begin their descent to a small valley ringed on 3 sides by rugged mountains and flanked by a mile-wide canyon. Touchdown is scheduled for tomorrow night at 11:15. AFN News coverage of the landing on the lunar surface will begin at 11:05 tomorrow night, Central European Time. While Scott and Irwin travel the lunar surface in their $8 million moon car, Worden will orbit alone for 68 hours in the Endeavour command ship, mapping 1/8 of the moon's surface. Since the flight began from Cape Kennedy Monday, the astronauts have encountered 1 rather serious and 3 minor problems. The most serious malfunction, an electrical short circuit in a switch controlling part of the craft's main engine, now has been overcome with the use of an unorthodox hand operating procedure. That hand operation was used when the trio blasted its way into lunar orbit. The other problems were minor but pesky, such as a broken glass altimeter cover in the Falcon, a short circuit that popped open an instrument lighting circuit breaker, and a leak in the drinking water system, a leak that the astronauts repaired with a wrench.
European time.
AFN World News and Sports Roundup, a summary of late developments from the wires of the AP and UPI. From the AFN Europe Central News Desk in Frankfurt, here is specialist Harvey Powers.
Good afternoon. The deadline is astronauts are still in a sleep period prior to one of their busiest days. Within the hour, the space trio are scheduled to awake. Their next major event will be a television transmission of the landing site as seen from lunar orbit. At 4:30 this afternoon, Central European Time, Irwin and Scott will enter the lunar module in preparation for the descent to the moon. That operation will occur shortly after 11 o'clock tonight, Central European Time. AFN News will resume live coverage of the flight of Apollo 15 at 11:05 tonight.
At the sound of the last tone, it will be 16 hours, Central European Time.
AFN News, a summary from the wires of the AP and UPI.
This is Specialist Brian Dowling reporting. In the news at this hour, the Apollo 15 astronauts are preparing for a moon landing that is scheduled for 11:15 tonight, Central European Time. The astronauts were awakened 12 minutes early today and told that while they slept, their moon orbit had lowered a little more than a mile. From their position at only 33,000 feet, the astronauts brought out their television camera and relayed back to Earth pictures of the lunar surface, including the mountains and canyons near where David Scott and James Irwin will land tonight. AFN will broadcast lunar landing coverage beginning at 11:05 tonight.
Central European Time is now 17 hours. AFN News, a summary from the wires of the AP and UPI. Here is Gary Bautel.
In the news at this hour, the Apollo 15 astronauts have sent back live television pictures of the area of the moon where two of them will land later today. The brief telecast was extremely clear. The astronauts were flying at about 7.5 nautical miles from the surface of the moon when they televised pictures of the rugged terrain. Astronauts David Scott and James Irwin are scheduled to land on the moon at 23:15 hours Central European Time. They will explore the lunar surface for 3 days with a specially designed vehicle. The third man, Alfred Worden, will remain in the command ship for scientific observations. AFN's coverage of the lunar landing will be at 23:05 hours tonight.